Why does everyone on the internet seem to have a clinical diagnosis? If you listen to anyone for any length of time, you're going to probably hear that everyone's ex, their adult child, their mother in law, and their boss is a narcissist. Everyone's calling each other a narcissist or toxic or some other terrible name just to get a rise out of them and throw them off kilter. And now that word seems to have lost all of its meaning. It's the go-to weapon we throw when a relationship breaks and when we want to ensure that we're labeled as the victim or the one who's in the right, and they're labeled as the monster. But what if weaponizing the word narcissist or any of its other friends like toxic or mentally ill is actually keeping you trapped in the very pain that you're trying to escape? What if diagnosing them is your brain's way of avoiding a much harder but much more liberating truth? One that can get you out of gridlock and moving towards actual peace. We live in a world where right has become wrong and wrong has become right, and just about anything, whether it's good or bad, can be used as a weapon against somebody to prove your point. This includes the labels that we've learned from places like TikTok that have now replaced actual communication and common sense. And they are getting in the way in some very real ways of sustaining connection and relationships. Because I know that many of you listening to me have been called a narcissist, or maybe you've called someone else on the other side a narcissist. Let's talk about what we're really doing when we do that. We're weaponizing a clinical word that belongs in a clinical setting. But instead of being something that can actually be useful and helpful and enlightening under the right circumstances, it's now being tossed around everywhere like a hot potato. The great irony in that is that everybody's talking about it, except, at least in my own experience, the mental health system where it belongs. That system massively failed my family when we were raising our kids who came to us with a severe trauma history. And it really would have been helpful if they would have actually said the word narcissist, especially in a clinical setting. It would have saved me decades of playing a role I never signed up for. It would have stopped me from absorbing all of the fallout of the family dysfunction that had been normalized for generations, and it would have kept me from trying to fix the unfixable that was rooted in other people's trauma and emotional immaturity. But they didn't. And by they, I mean dozens, many dozens of therapists, social workers, doctors, and other clinical professionals that we worked with while we were trying to survive the experience of raising traumatized kids. Here's what really bugs me the most about all of this, though. Narcissism is a real thing. It's a terrible thing. And if you've ever been caught in its ugly snare, you know that it leaves a wake of destruction everywhere it goes. And it creates very real and very deep, lifelong festering wounds. It also comes in a variety of different flavors, all of which look different on the surface, but have the same destructive nature and outcome. Yes, it's a clinical diagnosis, and it also requires someone with a professional degree and a license to diagnose it. At least in my experience, it's not something that most of those people who are qualified to do it are willing to put their names on. And the reason for that is very likely that the people who would most qualify for that diagnosis aren't the ones that are showing up in their office, and they can't or they won't make any kind of a diagnosis or even an inference on hearsay. However, practical and very painful experience has taught me that it's also a collection of very real and very predictable behaviors that show up in relationships. And someone doesn't need to qualify for a formal diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder to display a lot of narcissistic traits and patterns and to do a lot of damage. I also believe that this whole phenomenon of narcissism is much more prevalent than most people want to believe or admit to. It shows up everywhere. It's in the workplace, it's in churches, it's in families, it's in friendships, it's in schools, it's in local and federal governments. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you realize we are literally surrounded by it all day, every day. And it's to the point that it's become normal in a lot of ways. But it always starts, and it does the most damage inside of family relationships. The good part about this word narcissism or narcissist showing up everywhere on the internet is that the word is finally seeing the light of day. That's a very good thing, because when you understand what it actually is and how it functions and where it likes to hide, it truly can explain a lot of things. The bad part is most people don't actually understand it, especially the first time that somebody yells at you in anger or accusation. At that point, it becomes one of those good things that gets twisted around and becomes a weapon that is used inappropriately. Another part of this that we need to consider is that the person that is screaming it very likely doesn't know what it means either. They just know it's a highly charged, often offensive word that they've heard in some reel somewhere along the way. But it can effectively shock, hurt, and manipulate the receiver. And it's often aimed at someone they don't like, someone who has offended them, someone who doesn't agree with them or their life choices, or puts boundaries in place to protect themselves. They just know that it has the power to turn the tides and get them what they want. And they're honestly banking on the fact that you don't actually know what it means either, except now you do. Especially in the estrangement circles, there's something else that I've recently noticed. Estranged children are calling their parents narcissists, and parents are calling their children narcissists. And in a lot of cases, they're both using the same list of symptoms and criteria that was found on the internet to make the other person the bad guy. And they're fighting against each other while they're doing it. Both sides are pointing their fingers at the same monster of narcissism, but they're completely missing that both sides are standing in the wreckage of the exact same broken relationship and dysfunctional dynamics that are driving those narcissistic behaviors. They're just looking at it from two different vantage points. Let's talk about where these narcissistic traits and behaviors actually come from. They're not a genetic fluke. Narcissists are not born that way. They are created by their environment. What so many now refer to as narcissism was once a tragic and desperate survival strategy that was born out of profound fear, loss, relational trauma, and emotional neglect that likely happened during early childhood. They learned very early on that to survive their own family system, they had to build a bulletproof suit of armor that was made of self-preservation, grandiosity, and control, because having needs or showing vulnerability meant punishment, and in some cases, fear of death. The problem is there's no off switch. The behavior patterns didn't change or go away because the circumstances changed. That's likely because they learned what they were doing actually works. They discovered it's a highly effective means of getting what they want, avoiding punishment, and making sure their own needs are met, all while they're able to avoid dealing with painful emotions or memories or experiences, or risking being hurt by letting people get too close or being let down by them. These kind of behaviors are all rooted in trauma, in attachment problems, and often in family history and culture as well, because it's often what was modeled for them by the generations before. So if you're seeing what you can identify as narcissistic traits and behaviors starting to pop up, you're probably not wrong. Your partner or your family member or whoever might have some very deeply rooted survival behaviors. But calling them a clinical name, especially as an insult or a weapon or out of hurt, doesn't heal the situation or the relationship. It just adds more fuel to the fire, and it keeps you hooked in trying to defend yourself and prove your side of things and prove that you are right, all to an invisible jury. Now, we can't talk about narcissistic parents or adult children without talking about the ex. They're always the favorite villain in the story. They're the favorite person to blame for everything. I get it. They're easy targets. They're not here, and they're your ex for a reason. So they probably have done some terrible things. We're not going to leave it there though, because it's not just entirely about them. All relationships have two people. And if somewhere along the way you've been involved with a partner who turned out to have some narcissistic traits and behaviors, first of all, I'm sorry. You've probably been through some very hard things. But those traits were there before you were. At some point, you entered the relationship willingly and were invested in enough to make babies with them. So we have to talk about that quiet question that so rarely ever gets asked. What was it about that person, about that relationship, or that armor that they were wearing that felt like home to you? What attracted you to it or to them in the first place? I've done this for a long time. I've coached a lot of women through a lot of really rough situations. And so I'm going to make a bold statement as a result of that. Chances are great that this partner wasn't the first person in your life who required you to shrink, to overperform, to be perfect, or to ignore your own boundaries or needs in order to be loved. If we stay stuck in that he's a monster loop, we completely miss the opportunity for our own healing. We miss how seeing our own childhood wounds trained us to find comfort in that familiar chaos. It's not your fault you got into that. You probably didn't know any better. You also didn't deserve to be hurt, and you're not responsible for what they did or what they continue to do. And you also cannot overcompensate for it or make up for it. But you are responsible for figuring out your part, how you ended up with them, what needs did that relationship fill for you, and why was your guard down in the first place? Most importantly, it's also your job to see how your feelings, your beliefs, and your attitudes about that situation, about that person, and about your own life and history are impacting your family, your kids, and your relationship with your estranged child. And what parts of any of that are still lingering. As you can see, we're not talking here about individual monsters. We're not talking about who is right, who is wrong, or who is the bigger narcissist, or who is more at fault. We're talking about the systemic patterns that are passed down through the generations like an invisible inheritance. When estranged parents or their adult kids are screaming these weaponized clinical diagnoses at each other across the estrangement divide, what they're really doing is reacting to the same intergenerational pain. They're both trying to find safety. They're both trying to find resolution. They're both trying to find answers. They're both trying to find a way to explain a situation that doesn't make sense and won't make sense, at least from a logical or relational standpoint. But how they're going about it is by trying to make the other person the bad guy. It kind of makes sense that we do it. Those labels can make us feel safe. They can make it make sense. And if somebody can use the label of narcissist and make it stick on the other person, then they don't have to look at the messy, complicated reality of the relationship. And they also don't have to look at their own contributions, their own patterns, their own actions that may actually be harming the relationship as well. True cycle breaking starts when you stop trying to diagnose the system, and especially when you stop trying to diagnose the other person on the other side as being defunct. It happens when we start choosing to see and heal our own part of it, even when it's not comfortable, even when it's not pretty, even when it hurts. If you want some more pointers or things that you can do to reclaim your peace after estrangement, grab a copy of my free guide that's linked down below in the description. It offers a step-by-step outline of things that you can do right away to step out of the chaos, to break the gridlock, and start moving forward towards peace. To learn more about that great divide that really stands between estranged family members, click on that video right up there. I'll see you over there.